What if there was no Christian epic? What do you think? Is our liberty even possible without it? If the answer is yes, then why did Thomas Paine, the atheist Thomas Paine, maintained that endowed by their Creator were the four most important words in the Declaration of Independence? Welcome, I'm your host, Dr. Robert James. We will answer this question today here on Heritage Lost, the American Truth. Thomas Paine, born poor in England, with limited education, widowed and separated, came to America in 1774 at the behest of Ben Franklin. He began a new career as a journalist for Pennsylvania Magazine. His 1776 publication, Common Sense, established him as a revolutionary thinker. In that manuscript, he attacked British Constitution, opposed reconciliation, urged an immediate declaration of independence, and establishment of a republic. For him, the American Revolution was a crusade for a superior political system. However, often tactless, Paine provoked controversy wherever he went. He left for Europe in 1787 and spent the next 4 years between Britain and France. Edmund Burke's resistance to the French Revolution provoked Paine to create his most influential work, The Rights of Man. Later, he became a French citizen and a month later was elected to the National Convention. However, military defeat fanned Jacobinism into hysteria, and he was incarcerated in the Luxembourg prison for 1 year until James Monroe secured his release. All in all, he spent 10 years in France and had very limited impact on its intellectual foundations. Indeed, to the Jacobins, Paine was a moderate and faint-hearted. This episode of American Truth is the contrast that Paine saw that drove his political and intellectual ideas, one directly relevant to us today. A little more background. The Age of Reason, which was published in 1794, appears to be a deist manifesto. Nature is the only divine revelation. Paine bitterly rejects Christianity, denies the Bible is the revealed Word of God, condemns the Old Testament as stories that are immoral, and claims that the Gospels are marred by discrepancies, thereby rejecting any notion of a caring, interceding God. So that brings up a good question. What's the difference between a remote, uncaring God, unknown even to his chosen people who no longer, or perhaps never did, influence the events among men, at least that anyone could understand, and being an atheist? None, as far as I can tell. In all practicality, Paine was an atheist. And I'm not the only historian saying so. It seems to be also evidenced by his associations. Well, then why would an atheist, or even a very marginal deist at best, say that the precepts of God, active, distant, or non-existent, were the foundation of human freedom? Some of you in the audience are probably going, yeah, what's up with that, right? Well, first, let's look at the colonial revolution, the early American experience, and then compare it to a very different revolution, one devoid of Paine's Creator precept. What was colonial America like? Well, first of all, embraced biblical Christianity. In fact, in 1776, 94% of the colonists were Protestant. Nearly 3/4 of them were Calvinist, believing in sovereignty of God, a direct relationship with God, held by personal accountability. Often the Puritans come up in conversation. Now, the Puritans have been maligned in the media, almost entirely by secularists, by the way, but what the Puritans say about each other is very different. In chronicle after chronicle, the Puritans describe each other as joyful, well-organized, and an orderly bunch. They're good neighbors. William Tyndale describes the Puritans as filled with joy and filled with dependence on the divine. But wait a minute. That was the Puritans, right? Consider this.
One of the chief advocators of American independence was the Reverend George Whitefield. Now, we might have heard about Reverend Whitefield from the First Great Awakening, but we weren't told that George Whitefield is the guy who was urging Americans to separate from Great Britain. He said Great Britain is trying to force an established church on you. They're trying to take your liberties away, both civil and religious. Unless you separate, you won't preserve your liberties. We don't consider that to be part of revival preaching. It was part of the American Great Awakening revival. So Whitefield had such a substantial impact that not only did he go to Parliament to argue for the Americans when they did the Stamp Act in 1765, but he did so many things militarily wise to help the Americans get ready for it that when it came time, he died in 1770. He's buried in Newburyport, Massachusetts, and back then when they buried individuals, they often buried them inside the church. And in the case of very prominent ministers, they would kind of make a sarcophagus for them and put them perhaps down in the basement. A lot of other famous individuals, they literally buried in the aisles of the church. So they took and buried Whitefield down in the basement of the church. As the first troops are getting ready to leave from Massachusetts to go up and to try to engage the British as they're in Canada, up toward Quebec, etc., as they're getting ready to leave Newburyport to go to that battle in Canada, they stopped by the church where Whitefield was buried. They had a sermon preached there to the entire military before they left. And then the leader of the military, followed by all the guys, went downstairs. They lifted the top off that sarcophagus where Whitefield is buried. Now, this is 5-6 years after he's dead, so he's quite decayed. They reached inside that casket and started cutting pieces off his robe to take with them into battle, because he was the inspirational leader for American independence. They wanted to take this remembrance of the hero and what their hero had done and told them into battle.
Apparently, patriotism can be a little creepy. But here's the connection. Remember, the Puritans, we covered before, were Congregationalists and Presbyterians. And remember, George Whitefield was the spark of the Great Awakening of the Congregationists and Presbyterians that created the educational system that our founders used for their foundations. This is evidence of the connection from our American history that you certainly aren't going to get from Common Core. And that education is important. From the mid-1600s to the mid-1800s, government public schools were non-existent. Educational needs were by the free market through a benefactor or purchase of an apprenticeship to a lawyer, doctor, merchant, or something like that. And what was the result? Well, historically, it's already set. They expanded a nation, and by 1850 World's Fair in London began to eclipse industrial Europe with its innovations. Parents believed their responsibility was to teach their children how to make a living and also how to be decent moral contributors to society. Historically, our founding fathers had many examples that government should not rule education. In fact, to them, the responsibility of education should not be in government. Why? Because government could not be trusted. And here's the history. We have the Scottish Covenanters, the French Huguenots, the English and German Protestants, and even King James and the Puritans themselves. Note, tyrannies always seek to turn the weakest minds, whether it's the uneducated or the impoverished. Consider today, David Savage, the author of the anti-bullying campaign in our public schools, sets out to intimidate Christian children. He's on the internet doing exactly that. Islam is taught to the exclusion of Christianity or Judaism. Maybe there's a correlation. In a recent Department of Education study, the literacy rate in the colonies was greater than 90% for all free persons. Compare that to today's abysmal 60 to 70% literacy rate. And let's not forget the 25 to 30% dropout rate in public schools in the cities. We also have Robert Bennett, former Department of Education Secretary, who has come out on the record and says the SAT scores have been dumbed down twice. What government school advocates really hate, though, is the researcher Samuel Morrison, noting that the Boston Latin Grammar School was the only public school until 1684, when a public writing school was established. And it's probable that only the children who could read Latin and English were admitted. They must have learned somewhere. And it shows. The stock records of Boston booksellers in 1700 include no less than 11 dozen, 132, copies of spellers and 61 dozen reading primers. As Dr. Lawrence Kremen said during the colonial period, the Bible was the most influential textbook in the lives of Anglo-Americans. Summarizing St. Augustine, government is corporate morality. For no society, no government can exist without a common moral code. Without it, its very institutions descend into chaos and anarchy. So there's no out. We must choose. But be careful. Be very careful. For much is at stake, and millions yet unborn will praise us or curse us for the decisions that we make today. And so we begin by looking at two moral foundations that our founding fathers considered. In the next installment, Augustine's Blueprint Americanus.